What is the plan? Because there's a lot, there's a lot of young scientists in particular. They need papers for their careers and so on. By the time you do pause for breath, do manage to get things written up, they go to a journal. My experience as an editor has been things are a little bit out of date, and then they're extremely hard to figure out what you do with those papers because they're super important as a matter of record, but they're not the cutting edge science that you're used to arranging reviews for. Is there any kind of higher level discussion within this group about how that problem is going to be addressed?
Well, we can have that discussion at some point. I don't know if you can see the recording of the panel session from the Royal Society last week, because this was touched upon. Okay. I was slightly mistaken saying it wasn't written up. It rather hasn't been written as peer-reviewed papers. Quite a lot of stuff's been written on the fly appropriately for SPI-M or whichever committee. Yeah. As you well know, the preprint servers are completely jammed, submitting things to peer-reviewed journals. Forget it unless it's urgent and high impact. So a lot of the particularly beautiful work, for example, on Delta appearing, that's never going to get peer review published. It's game over for that. It's not relevant. And yes, that's a big problem for our early career researchers that put a lot of time in and did some really beautiful research at that time. Don't have an answer, but there is a huge problem with publishing in our field.
Can I put an answer into that? So some of the things we've actually been doing with Phil Trans at the Royal Society, we've had sort of series that are almost a retrospective look back at what we've done for policy with, a one-pager at the beginning that sort of says what was the context and what does it need for now. So I think there is the opportunity to do it, but I just think it is challenging.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that there's certainly going to be a problem if, particularly for early career people whose reputations rest on getting their work into certain types of journal. But there are other types of journal which prioritize scientific value over impact as such. And I think particularly the Royal Society journals, actually, that is one organization which does understand this problem. And I think it would be a big pity if, for instance, work on Delta doesn't ever appear in a proper scientific forum, because it's part of the record of how science has evolved. The fact that things have moved on so quickly doesn't mean that this work should not be in the peer-reviewed literature. And so I think it's a matter of possibly of choosing a different kind of journal. And then for several years, anyone interested in hiring promotions and so on is going to have to take this into account, that you're not going to get journals which might have been in Nature, Nature Communications, whatever, for some of this work, which is out of date almost immediately, but it's still science.
Thank you. Sorry, don't need that one, but so I'm now going to welcome Stuart Dalziel from the University of Cambridge to talk about aerosols, ventilation and the environment for about 20 minutes. I look forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Thank you. Oh, so apologies about the 3 Cambridge people on the road. In a sense, it wasn't meant to be that way. But this is going to be a bit of a whirlwind tour about ventilation, some of the decadal-long challenges that we actually sort of facing about this. So the challenges are coming not only from the pandemic, but from some of our added understanding as a result of the pandemic, as well as sort of climate change and all those other sort of pressures that we are becoming increasingly concerned about. So the underlying problem is, of course, we need to breathe. We're sensitive to what we breathe in, and what we breathe in sort of has impacts in terms of alertness, comfort, health, illness, etc. We breathe stuff out as well. And one of the problems here is that one of the things that we can breathe out if we're infected with something is a pathogen. Of course, this is influenced by things like coughing, laughing, running around, etc., the various activities that we're doing. I should apologize for the fact I'm probably going to end up coughing during the middle of this. This is not because I'm infectious at the moment, but because 2 weeks ago, I finally succumbed to COVID and it's triggered a cough for me. So apologies in advance. There are extreme solutions to this, and that we could all dress ourselves as Neil Armstrong did, but that's not really something which is valid going forwards. So, during times of high stress, then of course many things have been developed to try to protect our breathing and protect our breath from others. And so here are just a couple of examples, which is, For most of us, it was much more along these lines. Of course, for some of us, varies from person to person, varies from setting to setting, and still making considerable use of masks. If you're Dyson, then you see it as a marketing opportunity. And I don't know how many of you have seen, this isn't the original photo, but a modified version of the photo. I don't know how many of you you've seen this thing, which reminds me of Cybermen. But what, perhaps as part of ventilation, we need to think about what is the role of masks? Why actually are they any use to us? The problem is that we're breathing out droplets and aerosols. We'll come back to some of the details about the distinction there in a minute. But these fluid droplets that we're breathing out may contain infectious viral particles. The large ones are going to fall onto surfaces and may cause transmission via fomites. The smaller ones may remain airborne and be breathed in. So we'll talk more about that. But what masks do is, depending on the mask, it may simply redirect the flow. So a surgical style mask, when you're exhaling, it will capture some of the larger droplets, but most of the smaller ones, which can remain in suspension very easily, just escape. When you're breathing in, they've got some level of filtering associated with them, but not great. But FFP2 masks are much better at their second role. But there are lots of challenges with wearing masks, of course. It's not only sort of those of us who suffer asthma may have problems with them, comfort, communication. I'm going a little bit deaf, so not being able to lip read people is a problem. Visual impairment, eating, we're all going to be eating together at some point today probably, and so on. But during the first year of the pandemic, we did a little bit just to try to visualize sort of what the impact of a mask was. We don't have sound, but sort of this former student of ours was reading a passage from a BBC website about sort of 4G and COVID. But you can see that sort of as he's speaking, you can see these puffs going away from him. What we're actually seeing here is the heat signature. It's not CO2, but it's the heat signature that he's producing as a result of this. What we can also see is this general upward movement around him. That's against the heat signature from his body heat. In this case, he was seated, he was wearing trousers. We can see some of the motion upwards out here is coming from his legs. The video is now slowed down a bit to see, and you'll see that sort of given phrases produce quite different patterns. When we are speaking, we're going to be exhaling short bursts in different directions. So things like quite an explosive sound, which will produce a big puff, which will move away from the body and be able to then rise independently of that heat coming up from the body. Whereas if we're wearing a mask, it's maintained much closer to us. So while the smaller droplets, the aerosol-sized droplets, may still be escaping the mask, they're not escaping our body heat. They will rise up with our body heat. The buoyancy of that is much greater than that breath that escapes from it. I have to admit a conflict of interest here. I hate pantomime, but I was really concerned, and I was involved in some work with the DCMS sort of about sort of theatres, etc. And I was really concerned about the idea that pantomimes might go ahead in 2020. Because a pantomime, you can have the whole audience sort of laughing, shouting, even if they're wearing masks, continually exhaling all the air from their lungs, collapsing the alveoli to the point where, as they open again, they're producing small droplets, and potentially what was the most infectious part, we didn't know, but potentially the most infectious part. And so the thought about having a room full of grandparents, kids, whatever, was horrifying to me. So perhaps they should be banned. Of course, so the shots I've just shown you are in a quiet environment, so very little air movement. If we're moving around or there's significant air movement, what happens to our exhaled breath changes quite a lot. Rather than it just sort of rising from us, our heat rising from us, it all gets caught behind us in our wake. It doesn't matter whether it's because I'm moving or because the air's moving past me, it changes the pattern. It adds to the complexity about trying to understand whatever's happening. So the concentration of the exhaled breath in that wake is going to be very much lower. The heat concentration of the heat, the average buoyancy of that wake is going to be very much lower. It will be rising much more slowly and not too as high in the environment, particularly if the environment is stratified. But ultimately, masks are just a band-aid. We need to move to a place where we don't need to rely on masks to be able to sort of maintain a satisfactory environment. Precisely what that satisfactory environment means, and I think there's still a huge number of open questions about. But just thinking about droplets, if we have a large droplet, something over about 100 microns in size, it's just going to settle under its own buoyancy. The gravitational force will overcome sort of most of the air flows around it, and it's just going to settle out onto the floor and form a foamite. Whereas if we have a really small droplet, then it's going to be carried around by the turbulence in the air, and it's going to remain in suspension for quite a long time. Where's the size cutoff between these? Well, that's complicated by the fact that the droplets themselves evaporate really quite rapidly after we've exhaled them. So if we have a droplet around 50 microns in size, then it's going to start off falling, but then evaporate as it falls and starts to be carried around by the air. And that larger droplet is going to have probably a higher concentration of infectious particles after it's evaporated than before it's evaporated. So the larger ones which are evaporating are actually more of a problem than the really small ones, which have always been small because per droplet anyway, they carry much less infection. Although numerically, there may be an awful lot more than them. But where that balance lies, okay, that depends partly on things we don't know about the respiratory processes which are leading to the droplets containing infectious particles to start with. If we've got, going to ventilation now, if we've got a simple room, a well-mixed box, then it's easy to work out what's going to happen in terms of the ventilation. We could then make use of something like Wells-Riley to provide some sort of estimates of what the infectious potential of the room is, what the strength of the emissions are. We've got 3 orders of magnitude, depending on which of you happens to be today to be infectious. We may have someone who's 3 orders of magnitude more infectious than someone else. And so huge lots of uncertainties there, which aren't what I'm going to talk about. I'm rather going to be sort of starting to think about what happens when we don't have this well-mixed, isolated box that we can model easily. How can we tell when it's not? I'm going to gloss over the what is acceptable to some extent. Okay, so to be able to sort of understand ventilation, etc., we need to have models or proxies or some combination of them. The droplets that we're exhaling are in a sense only a proxy for the infectious potential of the virus, but actually measuring them is extremely hard in anything other than a clean room environment because there's so many anthropomorphic sources of aerosols. To be able to distinguish what's come from you rather than anyone else or from outside is a problem. We can use CO2. And indeed, you'll notice there's CO2 monitors scattered around both this room and upstairs where we've got refreshments. Just to try to sort of understand a little bit more about the space. It's cheap or cheapish existing technology. It's only providing us with point measurements. It's hard to get that overall picture of a space quickly. Those of us of a certain age will remember the days of pubs where smoking was allowed and just what an awful environment that is. And so many of us with long memories will think, well, do we want to go into a pub at the moment? So smoke, it's going to be a proxy, but maybe it's a proxy where there are health issues and regulations in place where it's not quite so useful. One of the thoughts I had at an early stage in the pandemic is to insist that everyone wore strong perfume. the problem is that our response to smell is so non-linear that actually it's pretty useless. One of the things that I played a little bit with, though, was other sort of volatile organic compounds. So one of my loaves, or 2 of my loaves of bread from during the pandemic, and what we see along the bottom here is a a trace from a total volatile organic compound sensor hiding in one of these. These showing that I was a bit later putting the bed on that day. So again, the problem with TVOC is there are many other sources. We are producing them as well in our exhaled breath. So what about artificial smoke, theatrical fog? So this is a room in Maths here in Cambridge where we were sort of doing one of many tests using this. It's great for visualizing what's going on. And now what I wanted to do is I wanted to actually do that in here today with you. And it would also provide a good way of demonstrating just how effective FFP2 masks can be, because if you put one of them on, you really don't notice there's any smoke there at all. The problem was, Churchill wasn't that keen on having to disable the fire sensors before we did it. So, but anyway, this room, it's a nice room. I don't know how many of you have even thought about how it's being ventilated. If you stick your hands under your seat, you'll feel sort of flow of air. So underneath all the seats, it's the inlets between about, yeah, it's underneath every individual seat. There's an air inlet. If you look up at, not at the front, but sort of the sides and at the back, you'll be able to see in the outside line of blue squares, you'll be able to see some extract point vents. So this is how this room is being ventilated. We're introducing cooled today, it will be cooled, fresh air at the bottom. It's then being infected upwards, partly by the fact it's coming in with some flow rate, partly by it being trained into the plume of body heat that we're producing. And we'll get an interface forming at some level. This is an overly simplistic model. We'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. Interface forming at some level, where the transport across that interface is produced by the entrainment of air into the plumes. We can work out the height of that interface. It's straightforward. Here, we've just taken there being n people in the room producing plumes, and then we'll approximate sort of the summation by an integral to work out what the height might be. Now, the good news is that this room's not full. Because the bad news, if the figures that have gone into this are right, we're not certain about that. But the bad news is that once we get more than about 50 people, then the interface will be about 4 meters up, which is about the height of those of you sitting in the back row. So it'll be interesting to see whether we have a change in seating after the coffee break. Now, this is oversimplistic. It's not taking into account the fact the doors are open there. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I can't tell you, because it's a thing. It's going to change it, but I can't, just standing here, I can't tell you whether that's a good or a bad thing. So I wanted to introduce smoke. It would be much more fun. Instead, we've got these CO2 monitors scattered around, and also some of us have got them sitting in the pockets. Now, what we've found is that sitting in your top pocket, it's really not affected by your own speaking and breath. So I can tell you that at the moment, sitting up the front here, I've got about 700 parts per thousand. A bit higher than I would have hoped, actually, given that we're only half full. We're relatively early in the day here, because that interface will have started off near the ceiling and gradually descended. It will eventually reach an equilibrium height if nothing else changed. Above that interface, well, we could say, well, actually, we've got about, because we're only half full, about 18 litres per second per person coming into the room, which is a good ventilation rate. So even if your head is above that interface, you're actually better off than in most spaces around the country. But nevertheless, it's a bit more complicated than that. Sort of, that interface is going to descend. It's going to have quite a complex structure. Above it, if we have the infectious person sitting at the front, their plume by the time it gets to the height of the interface is going to be this point than for someone sitting at the back. So the air is going to sort of spread out sort of at the base of that interface, and so that may be a bit more problematic. You'll be familiar with these ONS plots. So today we're sitting about here, about 2.5% of the population testing positive this week. So I tested positive not too long ago. On that basis, the probability, well, this is for 100 people in the room. We only got about 50, so I'd need to redo this. But if we had everyone here, there'd be a 92% chance there'd be at least someone who was positive this week if we were selected from random from the population. Of course, this is not a random sample of the population. So we do need to be concerned with it. But modeling these things, it's hard. There are far too many things that we just don't know about the ventilation. We don't know about the space and how sensitive things are to the space. This is another similar room. Again, a tiered lecture theatre, nominally ventilated in the same sort of way. But what our tests showed is that the flows in that room, basically they produced all of the contaminated air, came back across the stage, and the poor monkey standing up the front lecturing was going to be in a bad way, potentially. So some small modifications managed to solve that problem. This is a lot of rooms are trying to mix themselves well. This one isn't. This is called displacement ventilation, where the pressure is coming at the bottom, trying to push everything out the top. A lot of spaces have got the air's introduced with kinetic energy to try to mix it all up. It doesn't always work. The air changes per hour in this room, 17 air changes per hour. That's a really good ventilation rate for a room of this size. It's really good ventilation rate per person. However, the way it was introduced was disastrous, because it's like with many buildings, the ventilation was designed for cooling, not for heating. This was in the winter where the ventilation was providing heating, and what happened was the flow came in through the vent at the top, was directed along the ceiling. If it was cold air or vents would be unstable and should come down and cool everyone. Instead went straight out the extract ducts, which are also in the ceiling. These problems are very common. They're exacerbated by things like heat losses through the fabric of the building, what the distribution of people are in the room, etc. Things which, unless you've got very simple, very over-engineered ventilation systems, are difficult to deal with. Victorians, when we go to natural ventilation, Victorians were better than we are these days. These days, we've got these wonderful things called building management systems that get in the way. They prevent you from opening the windows as soon as it starts to rain, for example. And all sorts of challenges. That's trying to model this is the difficulties compounded by just how sensitive natural ventilation is to external conditions. Even if the windows, you can still open them, then the wind makes a huge difference. We've got fluctuations in the pressure field at the windows on the timescales of order of 10 seconds, which can fundamentally change sort of how things are happening. Running out of time, so we're going to have to skip over a lot of this. But spaces between spaces, they're also largely ignored by ventilation engineers and so on, but very important. One last one I want to point out, that the worst reading I have, so 8,600 parts per million of CO2. In a modern car with ventilation on auto. So if you've got a modern car with an auto setting for your ventilation, make sure it's not defaulting to recirculate, please. Because at this level, your consciousness is going to be severely impacted. But risk of being overwhelmed with this. So we need the thinker. But he's got so many thoughts coming out of him. And there's so many pressures coming back in. We need to have a way of resolving this problem. What do we need to do? We need to reduce transmission somehow. We need to improve the air quality, not only in terms of sort of CO2 and pollutants, etc. We want to reduce energy costs. We want to minimize environmental impact. We want to at least maintain some form of comfort, even if we need to reset people's expectations on that. Monitoring with fixed monitors is useful, but not, I think, ultimately the answer. So this sitting in my pocket is arguably more of the answer. This is an idea that we came up with early last year, which unfortunately we haven't quite managed to get to fly with it, but was actually extending the question, making use of many people to be the monitors, to be able to sort of assess what's happening in a broad variety of spaces. And not only in terms of sort of ventilation for COVID, but a much more general problem. And so the idea of being able to produce really very cheap sensors which hook into people's mobile phones through Bluetooth to provide us with data everywhere. I think that's actually one of the solutions to this, because we need to understand the problem to be able to really target the investment that's going to be necessary over a decadal timescale to solve our problems. So, thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask? Sorry, up the back.
Yeah, just, I mean, by listening to you, it feels like even there are, epidemiological model at large scale, it feels like there's such a disconnect. The difficulty, every room has different ventilation. So are we so far that we should just abandon the idea of connecting the two?
No. Well, I think the first stage is for us to get a better way of being able to decide, is this a simple room to understand, or is this a more complex room to understand? So some rooms are very simple to understand, and but we need to provide, we need to actually develop more of the science and more of the guidance to be able to identify these. One of the things I've been pushing for is HSC to require of businesses, for example, them to have a ventilation policy. At this point, in a sense, I don't care what the ventilation policy is, but that they need to actually start developing one. And there will, with time, sort of more requirements coming in as to standards, which will come partly from the building industry, the side building regulations, partly from regulatory authorities.
Just one more second. Can you actually get rid of that thing of it was following most of the titles? Thanks.
I think we've got.
Yeah.
Did you still have a question? Yeah.
Hello. I was wondering if there are any epidemiological data that can be used to validate or calibrate any of those models from contact tracing of transmission events in closed settings?
Well, so that's what we're in the process of trying to do. So the thing which we've got most information worldwide about is CO2 these days. The problem is that there are very few spaces in which have actually had the models applied to them, and whether that's analytical model or CFD models to actually be able to really understand what's happening in it. So that quick calculation that I showed for this room was something I did on Monday based on photos. This is the first time I've been in this room, so I just had to guess what the various heights it's were, etc. A lot of the information that's gone into that, there are huge uncertainties about things like what the airflow rate actually is in this room, and that we asked Churchill College about this, that they gave us their figures, but actually there's some consistency in their figures. There's an order of magnitude and consistency about what the airflow rate into this room actually is.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, the mic's just coming up.
This would be connected to a super spreading event if the bottom of the warm air went down as much as too much. How often are people in such environments? Do we know anything about this? Is there any way to measure how often people are in risky environments from a ventilation point of view?
So that's part of why I'm wandering around with this. And sort of, I've got a couple of postdocs in the room who've got these in their pockets as well, I think. So down here at the front, I'm below that environment. So Christina, what are you sitting at the moment?
Mine is 757.
Yeah. So actually at the moment, this room's still okay. The question is whether that's because of the open door, whether because we've got the reduced numbers here. And so the prediction was that actually at that height it would be more or less okay. And we've got, you may have seen, there's one here, it's on the back wall there, we've got sort of 3 up the wall to be able to sort of try to actually, for this room, assess it. But of course, we are standing at this sort of height. So in one sense, we don't care about what's up there. And that's part of the reason why I'm advocating for actually having wearable things. That I reckon that if there was the investment at the mass market level, we could probably get a sensor package which down to, I don't know, a few pounds to connect your mobile phone. And then everyone could go around wearing one. You could go to an event and be given one for free as part of your ticket, but to be able to actually collect this data. Of course, the personal data related issues would get in the way of the idea.
But are these reacting to CO2?
So these ones are reacting to CO2. They're a near-infrared dispersion sensor. These ones are reacting to volatile organic compounds.
Because I thought CO2 would be confounded by people walking on the streets, being in a car.
Yes. Yeah. And this is part of why make use of more than just CO2. So this is the sort of range of sensors that I was thinking of initially being in this package. And in fact, apart from the CO2, this has got most of those in it already.
We've got time for one really quick question before the next speaker.
Sorry, Stuart, thank you for an amazing talk. I really enjoyed it. I'm just wondering, do you know, or do we know the extent to which the room is important, or what the people inside the room are doing is important? And a sort of comment on your little wearable device. If, you know, we did achieve that time where everyone had one in their pocket, it could also be a way of triggering behavior change if you were able to kind of feed back to people in real time, you know, actually you're in an environment that's increasing in risk, and then people may be able to do other things. So I think there's huge potential there. Thank you.
Yeah. So in terms of the second, then very, very much so in that we can imagine sort of, rather than just your device for you, it's then sort of feeding up to the cloud, and the data's being aggregated there and analysed there through machine learning type things, and things like group planning, sort of prediction of risk. You want to go this way or that way. In terms of the activities within the room, then I think the simple answer is it depends on the nature of the room, and that something which is that well-mixed limit, then it's not going to matter so much whether you're moving around or whether you're stationary. It will matter in terms of your own aerosol generation, your own CO2 generation, what you're doing, but the environment itself in the sports hall tends to be very well mixed, and so very uniform on the intermediate scale. Obviously, very close, then it's different.
Thanks.
But in an environment like this where things are more quiescent, if we all suddenly start moving around, we will change it very substantially.
Thank you very much again, Stuart. We're now going to move to the next speaker, Mark Birkin, who's talking about dynamic microsimulation for epidemics, urban analytics.